world is going on?
Is that an A-10 right here?
The Afghan sun hadn't fully risen yet when Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen pushed open the heavy steel door of Hangar 7 at Kandahar Air Base. The temperature was already climbing toward brutal, the kind of heat that made the tarmac shimmer and sweat bloom instantly across skin. Marcus had been stationed here for 3 tours, and he'd learned to move with purpose during the early morning hours before the base became a furnace. His maintenance crew would arrive within the hour, and there was work to do, the kind of meticulous, unforgiving work that kept pilots alive. At 52 years old, Marcus Chen was among the oldest enlisted mechanics on the flight line. His uniform bore the patches and insignia of someone who'd earned respect through decades of service. But it was his hands that told the real story, scarred, calloused, permanently stained with hydraulic fluid that no amount of scrubbing could remove. These were the hands of a man who understood machines with an almost spiritual depth. Marcus had started as a young airman in the 1990s, working on fighters and transport planes through the Cold War's tail end. He'd been there when the Air Force introduced the A-10 Warthog to his maintenance rotation, and he'd spent the last 15 years mastering every system, every quirk, every hidden vulnerability of the aircraft. The A-10 was a remarkable machine, brutally functional, designed to survive punishment that would destroy other aircraft. It was built around its legendary 30mm rotary cannon, a weapon so powerful and so central to the aircraft's identity that every other system seemed almost secondary. But the A-10 was also a complex network of interconnected parts, and weakness in one area could cascade into catastrophic failure in another. Marcus understood this in his bones. As he walked through the hangar's cavernous interior, his eyes immediately found the aircraft he was here to inspect. Captain Sarah Mitchell's A-10, call sign Reaper, sat positioned under the maintenance lights like a patient on an operating table. The aircraft had performed well during her last 3 missions, but routine inspections were non-negotiable. Every aircraft, no matter how new or recently serviced, received the same rigorous examination. This was protocol born from decades of hard-won knowledge bought with the lives of pilots who'd flown aircraft that should have been grounded. Marcus began his walk-around inspection with the methodical precision of a surgeon. He started at the nose, checking the distinctive avionics suite, running his hands along the reinforced fuselage designed to protect the pilot. The A-10's pilot sits in a titanium bathtub of armor, one of the most protected cockpits in military aviation. Marcus had always respected that design. Someone, decades ago, had decided that a pilot's survival mattered enough to build armor around them. He moved along the fuselage, checking panel seals, looking for corrosion or wear. Everything appeared normal. Then he reached the left wing. Marcus stopped, his eyes narrowing. He moved closer to the pylon, the structural hardpoint where ordnance and fuel tanks could be mounted. At first glance, it looked fine, but Marcus's hands knew better. He'd learned long ago to trust his touch as much as his eyes. He ran his fingers along the bracket, feeling for the subtle imperfections that instruments sometimes missed. There, a slight irregularity in the weld. The metal felt wrong somehow, almost thin. Marcus pulled out his inspection tool and examined the area more closely. His stomach tightened. The structural integrity of the left wing pylon was compromised. Metal fatigue had created a hairline fracture that spread from the main weld like a spider's web. It was subtle enough that a cursory inspection would miss it, but Marcus had spent 15 years learning to see what others overlooked. This wasn't just a maintenance issue. This was the kind of flaw that killed pilots. Under combat stress, under the intense G-forces of evasive maneuvers or sustained turns, this pylon could fail. And if the pylon failed under load, the entire left wing could experience catastrophic structural failure. Marcus documented everything with precise photographs and measurements. His hands didn't shake, he was too professional for that, but inside his chest he felt a familiar knot of tension forming. He'd found critical flaws before. He'd grounded aircraft, and most of the time the system worked. Repairs were made. Flights were delayed. Aircraft were returned to service only when they were truly ready. But he'd also been in the military long enough to know that the system didn't always work that way. By 800 hours, Marcus had completed his formal inspection report. The document was unambiguous. The aircraft was grounded pending structural repairs to the left wing pylon. The repairs would take weeks, maybe longer, depending on whether fabrication of new parts was required. Marcus delivered the report personally to Major Richard Webb, the hangar commander. Webb was a competent officer, a career Air Force man who understood maintenance protocols. When he read Marcus's findings, his face darkened. "How long?" Webb asked, though he clearly already knew the answer. 3 weeks minimum, sir. Possibly 4 if we need to replace the entire pylon assembly. Webb set the report down on his desk and rubbed his temples. "We have a mission scheduled for Thursday. Close air support, high priority. The battalion commander specifically requested Captain Mitchell's aircraft." Marcus said nothing. He'd learned when to speak and when to stay silent. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" Webb continued. "Could this be a marginal reading, something that might still be within operating parameters?" "No, sir." Marcus's voice was steady, certain. "The structural failure is progressive. The fracture will expand under stress. In combat conditions with the G-forces from evasive maneuvers, this pylon could fail catastrophically. I'm certain of my assessment." Webb stood and walked to the window, looking out at the flight line. Somewhere out there, other pilots were preparing for flights. Other aircraft were being readied. The base hummed with the constant activity of a combat airbase, a machine designed for one purpose: getting aircraft and pilots into the fight. "I'll present this to command," Webb said finally. "But you know how this works, Sergeant. Mission requirements drive scheduling. They'll probably make a decision above my pay grade." Marcus nodded. He did know how it worked, and he feared he knew exactly what that decision would be. He spent the rest of the day waiting. By afternoon, the word came down. The mission would proceed. A different aircraft would be assigned if possible, but if not, Captain Mitchell would fly her A-10 with a repair hold on the left pylon until the maintenance could be completed after the mission. The aircraft was to be treated carefully, no aggressive maneuvers unless absolutely necessary. Marcus stood in the maintenance shed as he received the message, and something inside him broke. He'd done his job. He'd raised the alarm. He'd documented the danger clearly and professionally. And still, the machine would fly into combat with a known structural flaw. He thought of Sarah Mitchell, a competent pilot who'd worked hard to earn her place in a male-dominated cockpit. She was flying an aircraft he'd flagged as unsafe. At 1600 hours, Marcus removed his work apron, placed it neatly in his locker, and walked away from Hangar 7. He didn't formally notify anyone he was leaving. He simply walked, past the flight line, past the refueling trucks, past the armament crews loading ordnance. He walked until he reached the quiet maintenance office, where he sat alone, looking at his structural report, feeling the weight of a decision he hadn't made but couldn't escape. Captain Sarah Mitchell woke at 4:30 hours before her alarm. She trained herself years ago to wake automatically before dawn, a habit that served her well in military life. The BOQ, Bachelor Officers' Quarters, was quiet and still dark, the way she preferred to start her day. Sarah lay in bed for exactly 3 minutes, allowing her mind to transition from sleep to alertness. It was a ritual she'd developed after her first combat tour, a way to ensure that when her feet hit the floor, her body and mind were synchronized, ready for whatever the day demanded. The shower was hot and mercifully brief. Sarah wasn't one for long morning routines. Her mother had always criticized her pragmatism. "You're a woman, Sarah. You should take more time with yourself." But Sarah had never seen the logic in it. In her line of work, efficiency mattered more than appearance. She was a combat pilot, not a news anchor. She dressed in her flight suit, the dark green fabric carrying the patches and insignia that represented her journey to this moment. At 29 years old, Captain Sarah, Reaper, Mitchell had fought harder for her position in the cockpit than most of her male counterparts would ever understand. Her father had been an F-16 pilot in the 1980s, and she'd grown up with stories of his missions, his comrades, the weight and honor of the responsibility. She'd always known she wanted to fly, but knowing what you wanted and achieving it were two entirely different things. The Air Force Academy had been her first real test. She'd arrived with 73 other women in her class, all of them equally determined, equally intelligent, equally ambitious. By graduation, that number had dwindled. Sarah had endured the constant low-level sexism, the casual doubts from instructors, the whispered conversations that would stop when she entered a room. She'd survived because she was smart enough, tough enough, and stubborn enough to refuse to quit. She'd graduated 7th in her class. Pilot training had been harder. Some instructors had pushed her harder than they pushed the male pilots, watching for any sign of weakness. Others had gone easy on her, which was somehow worse. She could see it in their eyes, the doubt, the assumption that she needed protection. Sarah had proven herself through performance, through skill, through the simple fact that she could fly a jet better than most of the men around her. She'd earned her wings and her place on the flight line. By the time she reached Kandahar, Sarah had already completed one full combat tour. She'd logged over 300 combat flight hours. She delivered close air support that saved lives. She'd flown through enemy fire. She'd proven herself in the arena that mattered, not in training, but in the real world where decisions had consequences and pilots didn't come home. At 5:30 hours, Sarah walked into the ready room at Kandahar Air Base. The space was already filling with pilots and support personnel, navigators, weapons officers, intelligence briefers. This was where combat got planned, where maps were studied and risk was calculated and operations were born. Sarah grabbed a coffee from the communal pot, terrible coffee, the kind that tasted like it had been brewing since the previous day, and took a seat. Colonel Theodore "Hammer" Harrison stood at the front of the ready room, his expression grave. The mission brief began at 5:45 hours sharp. Harrison was the squadron commander, a pilot with 20 years of experience, a man who'd flown everything the Air Force flew and survived to command others. When he spoke, people listened. "Gentlemen, lady," he nodded towards Sarah, a small acknowledgement that she was the only woman in the flight roster that day. "We have a situation developing in the Panjshir Valley. Army Unit Bravo 7 is pinned down by coordinated Taliban forces. They're requesting immediate close air support. We're going to provide it." The intelligence officer stepped forward with maps and imagery. Sarah leaned forward, studying the terrain, the enemy positions, the location of the friendly forces. The situation was straightforward but urgent. American soldiers were in danger. They needed air support, and she was one of the pilots who could provide it. Colonel Harrison continued the briefing, laying out flight routes, target coordinates, expected enemy positions. Sarah's mind absorbed every detail, filed it away, began processing tactical options. This was what she'd trained for. This was why she'd endured the skepticism, the doubt, the constant need to prove herself. This moment, right here, was the purpose. As the briefing concluded, Sarah reviewed the flight manifest for her aircraft. Captain Stryker Rodriguez would be her wingman, a solid pilot, dependable, someone she'd flown with multiple times before. The aircraft were being prepped now, she knew. Weapons loaded, fuel tanks filled, systems checked by mechanics who understood that their work determined whether pilots came home alive. After the official briefing, Sarah walked to the scheduling board and checked which aircraft had been assigned to her flight. Reaper, her aircraft, the one she'd flown on her last 3 successful missions. Sarah felt a small surge of confidence. She knew that aircraft, knew its quirks, knew how it handled. Continuity was good. Flying the same aircraft meant familiarity, and familiarity in combat often meant survival. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, was that her aircraft had a structural flaw that would test her in ways no amount of training could prepare her for. At 700 hours, Sarah conducted her pre-flight with meticulous attention to detail. Every switch checked, every indicator verified, every system confirmed. She didn't know about the maintenance report filed by the gray-haired sergeant in Hangar 7. The report sat in an office, buried under operational decisions and command priorities. No one had bothered to tell her that her aircraft had been flagged as potentially unsafe. As Sarah climbed into the cockpit and ran through her startup sequence, she felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle onto her shoulders. There were American soldiers in that valley, soldiers who'd called for help, soldiers who were counting on her skill and her nerve to provide it. Sarah had never taken that responsibility lightly. She understood, in a way that only combat pilots truly understood, that the young people on the ground believed she would come back them. They believed she would make a difference between victory and defeat, between survival and tragedy. The engines roared to life, and Sarah felt the aircraft respond beneath her hands. Reaper was ready, and so was she. What she didn't know was that readiness and safety were about to become two very different things. The pre-flight checklist was second nature to Sarah Mitchell by now, but she never allowed herself to rush through it. Complacency killed pilots. She'd seen it happen. Experienced pilots who'd flown the same route 100 times, who thought they could skip a step, who paid the ultimate price for their overconfidence. Sarah maintained the discipline that had gotten her this far. The cockpit of the A-10 Warthog was cramped and utilitarian, designed for function rather than comfort. The seats were hard and unforgiving. The controls were mechanical and responsive, nothing like the fly-by-wire systems in modern fighters. Sarah appreciated the A-10's honesty. The aircraft didn't hide anything from its pilot. If something was wrong, you felt it. The A-10 demanded respect and skill, and it rewarded pilots who gave it both. Sarah's hands moved through the startup sequence with practiced precision. She'd done this hundreds of times, but the ritual never became automatic in her mind. Each switch, each button, each indicator represented a critical system that would keep her alive or fail her in the sky. The engine start procedure began with the hydraulic pumps, feeding pressurized fluid to every moving surface of the aircraft. The sound was distinctive, a high-pitched whine that rose in pitch as the system pressurized. Reaper Flight request taxi, Sarah transmitted to ground control, her voice steady and professional on the radio. Reaper Flight cleared to taxi to runway 03, came the response. Wind 020 at 8 knots. Sarah released the parking brakes and felt the aircraft begin to move. The A-10 was heavy, over 50,000 pounds fully loaded with fuel and ordnance, but it responded to her inputs with a sluggish grace. Behind her, Captain Rodriguez in his wingman position mimicked her movements perfectly. They'd flown together enough times that they moved as a single unit, their aircraft a matched pair of predators moving across the tarmac. The morning sun was intense, already heating the concrete runway beneath them. Heat shimmer rose off the tarmac in visible waves, creating optical illusions that made the distant end of the runway seem to ripple and dance. Sarah taxied carefully, navigating the narrow taxiway that led to the runway. Ground personnel watched her pass, some of them raising their hands in casual waves. Sarah didn't acknowledge them. Her focus was absolute. At the holding point near the runway threshold, Sarah completed her final checks. Engine temperatures normal, hydraulic pressures in the green, flight surfaces responding correctly, weapons loaded and armed, fuel sufficient for the mission profile plus emergency reserves. Everything was ready. Everything was perfect. Reaper Flight cleared for takeoff, ground control transmitted. Sarah felt her pulse quicken slightly, that normal rush of adrenaline that came before flight. She'd learned to use that adrenaline, to channel it into focus, rather than allowing it to become fear or anxiety. She advanced the throttles smoothly, feeling the twin General Electric turbofan engines begin their acceleration. The A-10's engines weren't the most powerful in the Air Force, but they were reliable. Ironically, the aircraft was sometimes called underpowered, but that didn't bother Sarah. She understood that the A-10 had never been designed to be a sprinter. It was a marathon runner, built for endurance and toughness rather than raw speed. The engines roared as she advanced them further, the sound building from a whine to a full-bodied roar that vibrated through her entire body. The aircraft accelerated down the runway. Sarah kept her eyes forward, scanning the instruments even as she felt the ground starting to release its grip on the wheels. The airspeed indicator climbed steadily. 100 knots, 120 knots. The runway stretched ahead of her, concrete and certainty. At 140 knots, Sarah gently pulled back on the stick. The nose of the aircraft pitched upward, and suddenly the concrete was gone. The wheels left the runway, and the A-10 transitioned from a ground vehicle into an aerial platform. Sarah felt the weight of the aircraft shift, felt the air beginning to support them instead of the earth. It was a sensation she'd experienced hundreds of times, and it never failed to produce a small surge of profound satisfaction. "Reaper Flight airborne," she transmitted, climbing steadily. "Roger, Reaper Flight. Turn left heading 270, climb to flight level 15, ground control responded." Sarah banked the aircraft gently to the left, coordinating her turn with her wingman. Rodriguez stayed locked in formation beside her, his aircraft a dark silhouette against the morning sky. The base fell away beneath them, becoming smaller, less significant. The desert stretched out in every direction, tan and brown and vast, interrupted only by the occasional ridge of mountains. As they climbed higher, the air became clearer, thinner, cooler. Sarah could see for miles in every direction. To the south, the Hindu Kush Mountains rose like jagged teeth against the horizon. To the east, the terrain became progressively more rugged, more mountainous, the territory where insurgents operated, where conflicts played out far from the eyes of the world. Sarah's mind began to shift into combat mode. The casual part of her consciousness that noticed things like the beauty of the landscape started to recede. The tactical, analytical part of her mind came to the fore. She reviewed the mission brief mentally. Panjshir Valley. Bravo 7 pinned down. Enemy forces estimated at 30 to 50 fighters. Air support critical. "Reaper Flight, contact Cricket," the radio crackled. Cricket was the airborne early warning and control aircraft, the AWACS, that monitored the tactical situation across the entire region. "Cricket, Reaper Flight, level at flight level 15, heading 270, Sarah responded, already knowing that Cricket had been tracking them since takeoff. "Reaper Flight, Cricket, we have the valley in sight. Multiple enemy positions confirmed. Friendlies are in the southern sector. Recommend approach from the north, avoid the ridge systems to the east. Significant air defense activity reported there." Sarah filed away the information, already beginning to calculate approach vectors and tactical options. The A-10 was designed for exactly this kind of work: low altitude, close in support where the pilot needed to see targets clearly. Unlike modern fighters that could engage targets from miles away, the A-10 required its pilot to get close, to see the enemy face-to-face almost. As they crossed the threshold into hostile territory, Sarah felt the subtle shift that always came with transition from training to actual combat operations. This wasn't a simulation. There were no reset buttons, no do-overs. The decisions she made in the next few minutes would have real consequences for real people. "Reaper Flight, descend to altitude 8,000 feet. Prepare for contact with Bravo 7, Cricket transmitted. Sarah pushed the nose down and began losing altitude, watching the ground grow steadily larger and more detailed below her. The valley appeared, brown and harsh, cut through with seasonal water channels and dotted with small compounds and villages. Somewhere down there, American soldiers were in danger. Somewhere down there, the enemy was waiting. Sarah's hands were steady on the controls. Her breathing was calm and measured. She was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she trained for. She had no idea that the aircraft beneath her was carrying a hidden vulnerability, a structural flaw that would test her in ways no training exercise could have prepared her for. The mission had begun. The valley unfolded beneath Sarah like a tactical map come to life. From her altitude of 8,000 feet, she could see the terrain in precise detail, the narrow roads, the scattered compounds, the ridgelines that provided natural fortifications for defensive positions. But it was the muzzle flashes that commanded her attention. "Reaper Flight, Bravo 7, we have you visual," crackled a voice over the radio. The voice belonged to a young soldier on the ground, someone probably in his early 20s, someone whose life depended on the next few minutes of her actions. "We're in the southern sector, taking heavy fire from the ridgeline to the north. Enemy has us pinned down. We need immediate suppression." Sarah banked her aircraft slightly, adjusting her approach vector. Behind her, Rodriguez maintained formation. The A-10 wasn't built for speed or high-altitude maneuvers, but at lower altitudes in the arena where close air support missions happened, it was devastating. "Bravo 7, Reaper Flight has you visual," Sarah transmitted back. She could see the American positions now, muzzle flashes from their return fire, the dust clouds their rounds were kicking up. And above them, on the northern ridgeline, she could see the enemy positions. The Taliban fighters had chosen excellent defensive ground, using the terrain and natural rock formations as cover. "Reaper Flight, weapons free," the ground controller cleared her to engage. "Cleared for gun pass on the northern ridgeline." Sarah felt a surge of intensity, the moment crystallizing into absolute focus. This was it. This was the moment her training and experience converged with real combat operations. Lives hung in the balance. American soldiers below were counting on her skill. Enemy fighters on the ridge were about to learn why the A-10 was called the most feared close air support platform in the world. Sarah pulled the nose of her aircraft down toward the target, initiating her attack run. The altimeter unwound as she descended, the ground rushing up to meet her. At this low altitude, there was no margin for error. She needed to be precise, aggressive, and absolutely committed to the attack. Rolling in hot, she transmitted to her wingman and ground control. The ridgeline filled her targeting display. Sarah could see individual enemy fighters now, could see them moving, could see them preparing to engage her as she descended toward them. She kept her nose pointed at the target, her hand steady on the control stick, her eyes locked on the firing solution. The A-10's primary weapon was its 30mm GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon, a weapon so powerful and so central to the aircraft's design that the A-10 was essentially built around it. The gun could fire up to 4,200 rounds per minute, each round the size of a coffee can, each round capable of penetrating armor and fortifications. When the A-10 fired its gun, the entire aircraft shuddered from the recoil. At 500 feet altitude, Sarah had her firing solution locked. She pressed the trigger. The gun roared to life with a distinctive, terrifying sound, a low-frequency rumble that was unlike any other weapon system in aviation. The rounds came out like a stream of fire, impacting the ridgeline in a pattern of devastation. Dust and rock exploded upward. Enemy positions erupted in chaos. The recoil of the gun was so powerful that it actually slowed the aircraft slightly as she fired. "Direct hits on target," Sarah called out, her voice steady and professional even as she watched the destruction unfold beneath her. She held her firing solution for another 2 seconds, pouring rounds into the enemy position, then began her pull-out. The A-10 responded, nose coming up, altitude beginning to increase. Sarah felt the G-forces building as she pulled hard on the stick, demanding that the aircraft transition from attack mode back to a more defensive posture. "Reaper 1, brake left," Rodriguez's voice suddenly screamed into her headset. "Multiple SAM launches." Sarah's entire body went cold. Surface-to-air missiles. The Taliban had been waiting for her, had hidden their air defense systems, had waited for her attack run before revealing their position. It was a trap, a sophisticated one, the kind of coordination that suggested outside training and support. The threat warning system in Sarah's cockpit erupted into a cacophony of warnings. The displays lit up with hostile contacts, Multiple radar sources were painting her aircraft, tracking her, preparing to fire. Sarah's years of training took over. She rolled the aircraft hard to the left, pulling the nose down, initiating aggressive evasive maneuvers. "Chaff," she called out, deploying electronic countermeasures to confuse the radar systems. The aircraft shuddered as the dispensers ejected metallic strips designed to create false targets on enemy radar. The first missile came up from the ground like a bright star, climbing rapidly toward her. Sarah watched it with a mixture of fear and adrenaline-fueled focus. She'd trained for this. She'd prepared for exactly this scenario in the simulator countless times. But simulation and reality were fundamentally different things. The missile was real. The danger was real. Sarah banked hard to the right, pulling more G-forces, demanding maximum responsiveness from the aircraft. The left wing dipped as she initiated the turn, and suddenly, without warning, something felt fundamentally wrong. The aircraft didn't respond the way it should have. Sarah felt a vibration in the left wing, a flutter that wasn't normal, a sensation of instability. For just a fraction of a second, she wondered if she'd imagined it, but her years of flight experience told her she hadn't. Something structural had shifted. Something had failed. The first missile passed behind her, missing by what felt like yards but was probably a couple hundred feet. Sarah didn't have time to celebrate the near miss. The radar warning system was still screaming, indicating more threats. She pulled hard on the stick again, demanding another sharp turn. This time, the vibration in the left wing was worse, more pronounced. The aircraft felt like it was being pulled toward the left, like something fundamental in the wing structure was compromised. Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. Engine failure. No, both engines were reading normal. Hydraulic failure. The pressure was lower than she'd like, but not critical. Structural damage. That was the fear that crystallized in her mind. She'd taken ground fire. The shrapnel from the missile impacts in the valley below had come close. Had something hit her aircraft? Had she taken damage she hadn't noticed? "Reaper 1, you're damaged," Rodriguez called out urgently. "Left wing is trailing fuel." Sarah looked at her gauges. Rodriguez was right. Fuel pressure on the left side was dropping, and that vibration, that horrible, wrong vibration, was continuing, getting worse. "Reaper Flight, we've got a problem," Sarah transmitted to ground control, working to keep her voice level even as her mind calculated the scope of the disaster. "We're hit. Heavy damage. Left wing structural integrity is compromised. I'm declaring emergency." A second missile came up, less accurately tracked than the first but still climbing toward her. Sarah had to focus on survival now. The close air support mission was finished. The only question remaining was whether she'd make it back to base alive or become another casualty of war. She pushed the throttles forward, trying to climb away from the dangerous lower altitudes where the air defense systems were most effective. The aircraft climbed reluctantly, heavy and damaged and dying by degrees. Sarah didn't know that the structural flaw Marcus Chen had discovered, the weakened left wing pylon, was now at the center of her crisis. But she was about to learn just how critical his warning had been. The moment stretched into an eternity of seconds. Sarah's hands moved on pure instinct, muscle memory refined through years of training and real-world experience. The left wing was pulling hard, the aircraft wanting to roll left despite her constant correction on the control stick. Every movement of the stick required conscious effort, deliberate strength. The aircraft was fighting her, dying piece by piece, and she had to fight back harder. "Reaper 1, what's your status?" Cricket's voice came through calm and professional, but Sarah could hear the underlying tension. The AWACS controller understood what she was dealing with. An aircraft with structural damage over hostile territory, 120 miles from safety. "Cricket, Reaper 1 is heavy damage," Sarah reported, her voice tight with concentration. "Right engine is still functional but losing efficiency. Left engine is marginal. Hydraulic pressure in the left system is dropping fast. The left wing is structurally compromised. I'm descending slowly and heading for home." Sarah's eyes scanned her instrument panel, cataloging the damage systematically. The information on her displays told a story of progressive failure. The right engine was still producing thrust, but the readings showed signs of stress and partial damage. The left engine was operating below normal parameters, the fuel flow erratic, but it was the hydraulic systems that concerned her most. The A-10 had triple redundant hydraulic systems, a design feature that had saved countless pilots' lives, but this redundancy only worked if the systems remained intact. Sarah's left hydraulic system was failing. The pressure gauge was dropping steadily, a slow countdown toward complete system failure. When it failed entirely, she would lose all the flight controls powered by that system. Sarah pulled the control stick hard and the aircraft responded sluggishly. The left wing continued to vibrate, a sickening flutter that seemed to promise imminent structural failure. She could feel it in the controls. The aircraft wasn't flying normally anymore. It was flying like something wounded, like a bird with a broken wing struggling to stay aloft. "We need to establish the extent of the damage," Sarah said aloud, more to herself than to anyone listening on the radio. She carefully reduced her descent rate, trying to minimize the G-forces on the damaged wing. Every turn, every maneuver, every input she made put additional stress on the weakened structure. Behind her, Captain Rodriguez had moved into a higher altitude, giving himself safety margin and separation from the damaged aircraft. "Reaper 1, I'm visual on your damage. Definitely something wrong with the left wing. Can't determine exact extent from here, but it looks significant." Sarah already knew it was significant. She could feel it in every square inch of the control stick. The aircraft was compensating for its damage by becoming less responsive, more sluggish. The smooth, responsive flying machine that had taken off this morning from Kandahar had become something unpredictable and dangerous. The threat warning system was still active, still indicating hostile radar activity below. But Sarah was climbing away from the main threat envelope, and the missiles had exhausted their ability to track her. For now, the immediate danger from the ground had passed. The real danger was the aircraft itself, the damage that was continuing to develop as she flew. Sarah checked her heading toward the airbase, still 120 miles out. At her current altitude and reduced airspeed, that meant at least 40 minutes of flying. 40 minutes in an aircraft that was deteriorating with each passing moment. 40 minutes of constant vigilance, constant correction, constant fighting to keep the aircraft flying. "Reaper flight suggests direct routing back to base," Cricket transmitted. "We're clearing traffic ahead of you. Direct vector 270, descend to altitude 5,000 feet at your discretion." Sarah acknowledged the vector. Direct routing meant fewer turns, less stress on the damaged structure. Every turn she didn't have to make was a small victory. Every mile she covered without additional damage was a step closer to survival. The vibration in the left wing continued. Sarah tried not to focus on it, but it was impossible to ignore. The flutter was like a constant reminder that her aircraft was dying, that at some point, some unknowable moment in the future, the structure would fail completely. When it did, she would either eject and become a prisoner of war in hostile territory, or she would stay with the aircraft and ride it down. Neither option appealed to her. Sarah reduced her descent rate further, trying to keep the aircraft as light as possible, putting as little stress on the damaged wing as possible. This meant she would arrive at the airbase at lower altitude, which would complicate her landing, but it improved her chances of getting there in one piece. The desert stretched below her, vast and empty and merciless. There were no emergency landing strips out here, no friendly positions that could provide security if she had to eject. Everything depended on getting back to Kandahar. Everything depended on the aircraft staying intact long enough. Sarah's hands were getting tired from the constant correction needed to keep the aircraft level. She had to apply continuous pressure to the right on the control stick to counteract the left wing's tendency to drop. It was like fighting the aircraft constantly, wrestling with it mile after mile. "Status check, Reaper 1, Rodriguez called. He was maintaining his own flight path parallel to hers, staying close enough to provide support but not so close that he'd be damaged if her aircraft suddenly came apart. "Left hydraulic pressure is now at 30%, Sarah reported. "I'm losing altitude slowly even with climb power. The left wing is getting worse. I don't know how long I can keep this bird flying." The words came out calmly, professionally, but inside Sarah's chest her heart was racing. Fear was there, deep, primal fear, but she'd learned long ago to compartmentalize it, to put it in a box and lock it away where it couldn't affect her performance. Panic killed pilots. Discipline kept them alive. She checked her fuel status. She had enough to reach the base with reserves, but only if she flew a direct route and maintained current fuel consumption. Any deviations, any emergency maneuvers, any complications would burn additional fuel she didn't have. Sarah focused on the horizon, on the distant mountains that marked the approach to Kandahar. Somewhere beyond those mountains was the air base. Somewhere beyond those mountains was safety. Somewhere beyond those mountains, if she could fly this broken aircraft without losing it, mechanics and medics and people who cared whether she lived or died. The left hydraulic pressure continued to drop, now at 20%. Sarah checked the backup systems. The triple redundancy meant she still had other hydraulic systems available, but each one was critical for different flight controls. The loss of any single system would degrade her ability to control the aircraft. "Cricket, Reaper 1, Sarah transmitted, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I'm going to need priority landing at Kandahar. Aircraft is heavily damaged. I may lose hydraulic pressure completely before I can get to the field." "Roger, Reaper 1, you have priority. All other traffic is being cleared. Runway 03 is standing by. We have emergency equipment ready." The professional response didn't match the reality of what was happening. There was no confidence in those words, just careful protocol. Cricket understood that Sarah might not make it. Everyone who heard the transmissions understood that possibility. But Sarah was going to make it. She had to make it. Below her were the soldiers she'd been supporting, soldiers who'd seen her aircraft get hit, soldiers who were probably wondering if their air support was going to make it home. And above her was the challenge of her lifetime, flying a dying aircraft across a hostile desert while her hands ached and her concentration laser-focused and her will absolute. Sarah checked her heading one more time and pushed forward, 1 mile at a time, 1 minute at a time, 1 breath at a time. The impossible journey home had begun. The radio transmission crackled through the maintenance office at exactly 11:47 hours. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen heard it at the same moment as everyone else, the words that would define the rest of the day, the words that would confirm his worst fears. "Cricket, Reaper 1 is heavy damage. Right engine is still functional but losing efficiency. Left engine is marginal. Hydraulic pressure in the left system is dropping fast. The left wing is structurally compromised." Marcus felt the words hit him like a physical blow. He was sitting alone in the maintenance office, staring at nothing, when Major Webb burst through the door. "Did you hear that?" Webb demanded, his face pale. Marcus nodded slowly. He had heard it, and in those words he heard the confirmation of everything he'd feared. The structural flaw he'd documented, the weakness he'd flagged, the warning that had been ignored, all of it was now manifesting in a real crisis, in real time, with a pilot fighting for her life because of decisions made by people who'd chosen to ignore his expertise. "The left wing," Marcus said quietly. "That's where I found the structural compromise." Webb's face darkened. He'd been the one to submit Marcus's report up the chain of command. He'd been the one who'd pushed back, even if weakly, against flying the aircraft. Now he looked like someone who'd been struck by a revelation of terrible proportions. "It's not your fault," Webb said, but the words rang hollow. They both knew it wasn't that simple. Marcus stood up from his desk and walked toward the flight line. He needed to see, needed to bear witness to what was happening. Other personnel were already gathering: mechanics, avionics technicians, weapons specialists, all the people who'd worked on Reaper's aircraft, all the people who understood the intimate details of that machine's systems and capabilities. The command center had activated its emergency protocols. The base's loudspeaker system crackled to life with official announcements. Emergency crew, stand by. Inbound aircraft, heavy damage, priority landing clearance on runway 03. Marcus pushed through the gathering crowd and made his way to the Flight Operations Center. Inside, people were hunched over radar displays and communication equipment, monitoring Sarah's slow approach. The radio chatter was constant, professional, controlled, but underneath the professionalism there was tension, palpable, electric tension. "Reaper 1, your current altitude," the controller asked. "Reaper 1, altitude 6,000 feet, descending gradually. Left hydraulic pressure is now at 20%. I'm maintaining control, but it's getting harder." Sarah's voice was steady, professional, almost calm. But Marcus could hear something underneath the calm, the sound of someone fighting with everything they had, someone pushing past fear and pain and exhaustion to accomplish one simple task: stay alive. Marcus felt his hands begin to shake. He clasped them together, trying to find some way to channel the helplessness he was experiencing. He'd walked away from his post this morning, defeated by the chain of command's decision to fly an unsafe aircraft. He'd surrendered to the system, accepted that his warning would be ignored, accepted that there was nothing more he could do. Now, watching the radar blip that represented Sarah's aircraft creeping slowly across the display, Marcus understood that acceptance wasn't the same as powerlessness. There were things he could do. He could be ready. He could make sure that when Sarah made it back, everything on the ground would be prepared to save her life. "Get me the emergency equipment status," Marcus said to no one in particular. But Webb heard him and immediately began coordinating with the fire and rescue crews. "Fire trucks are standing by," Webb reported. "Medical is prepped. Runway is being cleared of all traffic." Marcus nodded. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was the work of professionals responding to crisis with professionalism. It was the system working, even if the same system had allowed an unsafe aircraft to fly in the first place. The minutes stretched into an eternity of waiting. Sarah's aircraft was still 80 miles out. At her current speed, that meant another 45 minutes of flying, 45 more minutes of fighting the damaged aircraft, 45 more minutes of uncertainty. The base had fallen into that peculiar silence that precedes crisis. Normally, Kandahar Air Base hummed with constant activity, aircraft taking off, engines roaring, equipment moving, people working. Now, everyone was focused on the radio, on the one aircraft that mattered above all others. Marcus found himself standing on the flight line, staring at the sky toward the south, willing Sarah's aircraft to appear on the horizon. Other people gathered nearby, silently, each lost in their own thoughts. The mechanics who'd worked on Reaper knew that aircraft intimately. They knew its systems, its weaknesses, its capabilities. Somewhere out there, those systems were being pushed to their absolute limits. "Left wing pylon," Marcus heard one of his junior mechanics mutter. The young man was shaking his head. "I helped install that assembly. We did the work correctly. It wasn't a maintenance failure." "No," Marcus said quietly. "It was a material failure, metal fatigue, age, or maybe a defect from manufacturing. We caught it. We reported it, and they flew her anyway." The harsh truth hung in the air between them. Nothing anyone said would change that fundamental reality. An unsafe aircraft was in the sky, damaged, struggling to get home, and everyone at the base who understood the situation knew exactly why. The radio crackled again. "Reaper 1, you're 65 miles from base, current altitude." Reaper 1, altitude 4,500 feet. Continuing descent at 150 feet per minute. Left hydraulic is at 15% now. Aircraft is getting increasingly difficult to control. I've got to get this bird on the ground soon. Marcus closed his eyes. 15% hydraulic pressure. The aircraft was running on fumes now, on backup systems and sheer determination. How much longer could Sarah keep flying? How much longer before the remaining hydraulic pressure dropped to a point where she couldn't control the aircraft anymore? The wind picked up slightly and Marcus opened his eyes, looking toward the sky. The afternoon sun was beating down relentlessly, turning the tarmac into a shimmering surface. In the distance, toward the south, the mountains stood like silent sentinels. "Come on, Captain," Marcus whispered. "Come on home." Major Webb stood beside him, equally silent, equally helpless. Two men who understood aircraft and systems and engineering, both of them reduced to waiting and hopping. The professional understanding they carried, the knowledge of exactly how critical Sarah's situation was, made the waiting harder, not easier. The emergency vehicles lined the runway now. Fire trucks, ambulances, rescue equipment, all standing ready. The base's medical team was prepped and standing by. Everything that could be done on the ground had been done. Now it was up to Sarah and her skill and her will to keep the aircraft flying long enough to reach safety. Marcus thought about the moment he'd found the structural flaw, the moment he'd realized the danger. He thought about the reports he'd filed, the warnings he'd issued. He thought about walking away from his post this morning, defeated, certain that his failure to prevent this disaster was absolute and complete. Now he understood something different. His job wasn't to control whether the aircraft flew or didn't fly. That decision belonged to the command structure. His job was to identify danger and communicate it clearly. He'd done that job well. What happened after that was beyond his control. The only thing left was to wait, and to hope, and to be ready for whatever came next. Sarah's eyes were locked on the distant landscape ahead. The mountains had become clearer now, more defined. Kandahar Air Base was close, maybe 30 miles out now, maybe 25 minutes of flying time if everything held together. That was assuming the aircraft didn't completely fail before she got there. That was assuming the remaining hydraulic pressure held. That was assuming the left wing didn't tear away entirely under the stresses of flight. A lot of assumptions. "Reaper 1, you're 35 miles from base," the controller transmitted. "Continue descent to 3,000 feet. Runway 03 is clear and ready for you. Emergency equipment is standing by." "Roger," Sarah acknowledged. Her voice was still steady, but the strain was beginning to show through. 45 minutes of constant fighting had exhausted her physically and mentally. Her hands ached from the constant pressure needed to keep the control stick corrected. Her shoulders were burning from maintaining the muscle tension required to fly an aircraft that didn't want to cooperate. Sarah checked her hydraulic pressure one more time, 10% now. She was operating on borrowed time, on the last reserves of her failing systems. The aircraft was dying minute by minute, system by system. The question was whether it would die fast enough to take her with it, or whether she could coax it to land before catastrophic failure occurred. The left wing vibration had become constant now, a rhythmic flutter that seemed to pulse with the aircraft's failing systems. Sarah had stopped thinking about it consciously. The vibration had become part of the baseline of her reality, part of the background noise of flying a crippled aircraft home. She made minute adjustments to her heading, correcting slightly to the left, compensating for the continuous pull of the damaged wing. Every input had to be carefully considered. Every movement of the control stick was an experiment in how much the aircraft would respond, how much control she actually had remaining. "Reaper 1, descend to altitude 2,500 feet, the controller instructed. Sarah pulled back slightly on the throttles and nosed the aircraft down. The descent was steady, measured, controlled. She was managing the dying aircraft with the skill of someone who'd spent her entire adult life understanding how to fly. But management and certainty were different things. Management was all she had right now. The air base appeared on the horizon, the runways, the taxiways, the buildings and hangars that represented safety and survival. Sarah felt a surge of something close to hope, though she forced herself not to get ahead of the moment. She still had to land this aircraft. She still had to accomplish the most difficult maneuver ahead of her. Landing an A-10 was normally straightforward. The aircraft was designed to land on short runways, to operate from austere locations. But landing an A-10 with compromised hydraulics and structural damage to the left wing was a completely different proposition. Sarah would need to maintain precise control through the approach, the descent, the touchdown, and the rollout. One mistake, one moment of lost focus, one hydraulic system failure at the wrong moment, and everything would come apart. "Reaper 1, you're 10 miles out," the controller said. "Descend to altitude 1,000 feet. Prepare for final approach." Sarah descended through 1,500 feet, 1,200 feet, 1,000 feet. The runway was visible now, clear and waiting. Fire trucks lined the taxiway, their emergency lights flashing in the afternoon sun. Medical vehicles were positioned nearby. Personnel in protective equipment stood ready. The base had mobilized every resource available to support her landing. Sarah felt a moment of profound gratitude for the people on the ground, for the systems and the protocols that had been activated to help her. She thought about Marcus Chen, the mechanic who'd found the structural flaw. She thought about all the people who'd trained her, who'd prepared her for this moment. She thought about the soldiers she'd supported in that valley, the ones who were probably watching this unfold on the radio back at their forward operating base. "Gear down," she commanded herself, reaching for the landing gear control. The hydraulic pressure needed to lower the landing gear was marginal. Sarah held her breath as she activated the system. The landing gear extended slowly, reluctantly. She heard the hydraulic pumps laboring, the system pushing to accomplish one of the most basic functions of flight. The down-end locked indicator finally illuminated. The wheels were down and secured. One more critical system completed before it failed entirely. "Reaper 1, gear is down and locked," Sarah reported. "Prepare for landing." "Roger, Reaper 1. You're cleared for landing on runway 03. Wind is calm. Emergency services are standing by." Sarah initiated her final descent. 800 feet, 700 feet, 600 feet. The runway stretched ahead of her, concrete and safety and the promise of survival. Her landing approach was shallow, controlled, perfect, everything a pilot should do when bringing a damaged aircraft home. 500 feet, 400 feet. She could see the individual concrete sections of the runway now, could see the markings that indicated distance remaining. 300 feet, 200 feet. The ground was rushing toward her, but not too fast, not in an uncontrolled way. She was managing the descent perfectly, flying the aircraft right to the edge of the envelope. 100 feet, 50 feet. Sarah's entire consciousness narrowed to the moment of touchdown. Everything else disappeared, the pain in her hands, the exhaustion in her shoulders, the fear that had been riding with her for the last 45 minutes. There was only the runway, the aircraft, and the moment of impact. The wheels touched concrete with a harsh jolt that reverberated through Sarah's entire body. The landing was harder than any she'd ever experienced, the impact of a heavy aircraft coming down with significant speed. But the wheels held. The landing gear absorbed the shock and stayed intact. The aircraft screamed down the runway, the main wheels locking momentarily before the anti-skid systems engaged. Sarah applied the wheel brakes, gentle at first, then increasing pressure as the aircraft's forward momentum gradually decreased. She felt the aircraft shudder and protest, felt systems struggling and failing under the stress of deceleration. But she kept her focus on controlling the descent, on managing the rollout, on keeping the aircraft on the center line of the runway. The A-10 slowed to 200 knots, 150 knots, 100 knots. The fire trucks were moving now, parallel to her flight path, ready to respond if flames erupted. But there were no flames. The aircraft was damaged but intact, dying but not dead. 75 knots, 50 knots, 30 knots. The speed dropped continuously, the aircraft's forward momentum bleeding away with each second. 20 knots, 15 knots. The runway ahead of her seemed to stretch endlessly, but she was slowing, decelerating, bringing the enormous weight of the A-10 and all its systems to a controlled stop. Finally, mercifully, the aircraft rolled to a complete halt. The wheels locked. The engines continued to spool down. For a moment, there was only the sound of those dying engines, the hiss of hot metal cooling, the settling of a machine that had pushed itself to the very edge of its capabilities. Sarah sat in the cockpit, her hands shaking violently now that the flying was over. She was alive. The aircraft was intact. She'd done it. Against all odds, against a damaged structure and failing systems, she'd brought the A-10 home. The radio crackled to life. Reaper 1, welcome home. Excellent flying. Emergency equipment is moving to your position. Sarah couldn't respond immediately. She was breathing hard, her body finally acknowledging the stress it had endured. She keyed the radio after a long moment. Kandahar, Reaper 1 is down and secure. Aircraft is heavily damaged but intact. I'm okay. Those 4 words, I'm okay, seemed to spread across the airbase like electricity. Personnel cheered. Fire trucks began their approach. The crisis was over. Sarah had brought her aircraft home. The canopy of the A-10 lifted with a hydraulic hiss that sounded like a final breath being released. Sarah Mitchell sat motionless for a moment in the cockpit, her hands still trembling, her body processing the aftermath of survival. The emergency equipment had surrounded the aircraft, but they were holding back, giving her space. She was the priority, but she was also the expert on her own situation, and they waited for her signal. Sarah unfastened her harness with shaking fingers. The normal multi-point safety harness that kept her secure during flight now felt like chains binding her to a moment she needed to escape. She pulled the harness loose and slowly, carefully, climbed out of the cockpit. Her legs were unsteady when her boots touched the canopy frame. The ground suddenly seemed very far away. Paramedics rushed forward to help her down. They wanted to assess her for injuries, wanted to get her into an ambulance for emergency evaluation. Sarah waved them off gently but firmly. I'm fine, she said, her voice hoarse from hours of radio transmissions and stressed breathing. I need to see my aircraft. I need to understand what happened. The paramedics exchanged glances but complied. One of them walked alongside her as she approached the left side of the A-10, where the damage was most apparent. What they saw made everyone present stop and stare in stunned silence. The left wing was a disaster. The pylon, the structural hardpoint that Marcus Chen had flagged weeks ago, was visibly damaged, bent at an angle that should have been impossible to survive. Shrapnel had torn through the mounting brackets. The hydraulic lines had been partially severed, but the pylon was still attached. The wing was still intact. The aircraft had survived something that, on paper, should have caused immediate catastrophic failure. How did this hold? One of the junior mechanics whispered. Major Webb was standing near the aircraft, his face a mixture of relief and revelation. He saw Sarah approaching and moved to meet her. Behind him came a figure Sarah hadn't expected to see, Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen, the maintenance officer who'd flagged her aircraft as unsafe. Their eyes met across the tarmac. Marcus looked like a man who'd been through an emotional hurricane. His uniform was sweat-stained. His face was pale, but his eyes held something that looked like redemption mixed with deep concern. Captain Mitchell, Marcus said, his voice steady despite everything he'd been through. He saluted, the gesture formal and precise even in the chaos of the emergency scene. Sarah returned the salute, then broke protocol and extended her hand. Marcus took it, And they stood there for a moment, mechanic and pilot, the man who'd warned and the woman who'd flown, connected by a chain of events that had nearly killed her. "The pylon," Sarah said without preamble. "Your report, the structural flaw, tell me about it." Marcus took a breath. "Metal fatigue in the left wing pylon. I found it during routine inspection. The bracket had a hairline fracture that was spreading. I documented it completely and recommended grounding the aircraft pending repairs." "But the aircraft flew anyway," Sarah said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, ma'am. Command decided the mission was too important to delay. I walked away rather than watch it happen. I thought," Marcus's voice broke slightly, "I thought I was watching you go to your death." Sarah nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what he'd experienced. The aircraft was harder to control than it should have been. The left wing had a continuous vibration. When I took ground fire and started evading, that's when I felt the real failure. The pylon was bending under the G-forces. I thought it was going to tear the wing completely off. "But it didn't," Marcus said, looking at the bent but intact pylon. "The fracture expanded under stress exactly like I predicted it would, but the material properties of that alloy, even degraded, allowed for some flex. The pylon bent rather than shattered. It gave way gradually rather than catastrophically." An engineer from the base's technical operations section had joined them, notepad in hand. "We're going to need to document this completely," the engineer said. "This is going to go into every engineering database in the Air Force. A failure mode that should have been catastrophic but wasn't. The metallurgy alone will be studied for years." Marcus looked at Sarah. "The point is, Captain, you flew a structurally compromised aircraft through combat conditions and came home alive. That shouldn't have been possible." "It was possible because of you," Sarah said quietly. "Because you identified the problem, documented it, and made sure the chain of command understood the risk. When I was up there fighting that aircraft, I could feel something was wrong with the wing. I knew what to expect because somewhere in my subconscious, I'd absorbed the knowledge that that wing was compromised. I flew differently because of your warning. I was more careful. I managed my G-forces more conservatively. And when the moment came to get back, I knew exactly where to focus my concern." Webb stepped forward. "We failed you both," he said, addressing Marcus and Sarah simultaneously. "I submitted your report, Sergeant. I made sure it got to command, but I didn't push hard enough when they decided to fly anyway. I accepted their decision instead of fighting for what was right." "With respect, sir," Marcus said, "that's the system. You reported it. I reported it. The information was there. The decision makers had to weigh operational necessity against maintenance concerns. It's not a perfect system, but it's the system we have." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, looking at the damaged aircraft. "I want to say something," she said finally. "If Staff Sergeant Chen hadn't found that flaw, if he hadn't documented it, if he hadn't raised the alarm even knowing it might be ignored, I wouldn't be standing here. The fact that the warning was ignored doesn't diminish its importance. It just means that luck, design margins, and pilot skill came together at exactly the right moment. But I wouldn't have had the information in my head that helped me survive." The engineer was taking photographs now, documenting every angle of the damage. "The fractured pylon is going to be studied," he said. "We're going to understand exactly how it failed, and that understanding might save lives in the future." Over the following hours, the immediate crisis gave way to the protocols that followed any major incident. Sarah underwent a thorough medical evaluation. The aircraft was impounded for complete engineering analysis. Command initiated investigations into the decision-making process that had led to the aircraft flying despite the documented structural flaw. As the sun began to set over Kandahar Air Base, Sarah found Marcus in the maintenance section. He was sitting alone on a bench outside Hangar 7, staring at nothing in particular. "Thank you," Sarah said simply, sitting down beside him. Marcus didn't respond immediately. "I almost didn't do my job right," he said finally. I was so defeated by the decision to fly that aircraft that I walked away. If something had been different, if the damage had been worse, if the material had failed completely, I would have spent the rest of my life knowing I'd given up when I should have fought harder. But you did do your job, Sarah said. You identified the danger, you documented it, you made sure the information was in the system. What happened after that wasn't your responsibility anymore. It never stops feeling like my responsibility, Marcus said quietly. Sarah understood that. She understood the weight of responsibility that came with being in command, whether of an aircraft or of a maintenance section. She understood the burden of knowing that lives depended on decisions made in moments of pressure and uncertainty. I'm going to make sure this story gets told, Sarah said. Not as a criticism of command or a failure of the system, but as an example of how the right information, delivered by people who care about safety, can save lives even when things go wrong. Your warning mattered. It probably saved my life. Marcus nodded slowly. That's all anyone can do, he said. Provide the best information you can and hope it makes a difference. As darkness fell over the base, the two of them sat in silence, a pilot and a mechanic, connected by a mission that had pushed them both to the edge of human capability. In the hangar behind them, the damaged A-10 sat waiting for engineers and investigators to document its failure and its survival. The story of the engineer who gave up, and the pilot who proved that even flawed steel could carry heroes home, had become part of military legend.